The room is quiet. Too quiet. You are sitting on the edge of your bed long after everyone else has gone to sleep, staring into the darkness, replaying the same thought you have been trying to push away for weeks, months, maybe years. You do not want to think it. You do not even like that it exists. Yet there it is again, refusing to leave. You prayed, you waited, you trusted, you believed, and nothing happened. Or maybe something happened, but not the thing you desperately hoped would happen. The person still died, the relationship still ended, the depression still came back, the fear still followed you home, the future remained uncertain, and now a question begins to form that feels almost forbidden to ask. Not because someone told you not to ask it, but because asking it feels like opening a door you may never be able to close. What if the thing you have always relied on no longer makes sense in the way it once did? What if the certainty that once comforted you now creates more questions than answers? Most people know this moment. Many never talk about it. They smile, they attend services, they repeat familiar words, they maintain appearances. But somewhere underneath the surface there is a quiet tension that refuses to disappear. Because there is a difference between having faith and understanding why you have it. There is a difference between believing something and knowing what happens when that belief collides with reality. The strange thing is that faith often feels strongest when life is simple, when things are working, when the story seems coherent, when events appear to support the conclusions you already hold. But life has a habit of introducing complications. It places people in situations where simple answers suddenly feel inadequate. It introduces suffering that seems random. It creates contradictions that refuse to resolve themselves. It exposes intelligent, thoughtful, sincere people to completely different beliefs, completely different experiences, completely different conclusions. And slowly, almost invisibly, something begins to happen. The certainty that once felt solid starts developing cracks. Not dramatic cracks, small ones. The kind you barely notice at first, the kind you can ignore for years, until one day you cannot. Maybe it starts when you meet someone whose kindness completely contradicts everything you expected. Maybe it starts when tragedy strikes someone who seemingly did nothing to deserve it. Maybe it starts when a prayer goes unanswered, or when multiple prayers go unanswered. Maybe it starts when you realize that two equally sincere people can pray with equal conviction and arrive at opposite conclusions. Maybe it starts when you discover that doubt is not the enemy you were taught to fear, but a natural consequence of thinking deeply about things that matter. The uncomfortable reality is that most people do not lose certainty all at once. It erodes gradually, one question at a time, one contradiction at a time, one sleepless night at a time, one difficult conversation at a time. And often the person experiencing it feels completely alone because everyone around them seems so sure. Yet if you could somehow listen to the private thoughts of thousands of people, you might discover that uncertainty is far more common than certainty. Many people spend years wondering whether everyone else possesses a confidence they themselves lack. They assume they are uniquely confused, uniquely flawed, uniquely weak. But perhaps the hidden truth is that questioning is far more human than pretending not to question. Think about a child looking at the world for the first time. Children ask endless questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do people die? Why does suffering exist? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does one person survive while another does not? The child does not know these questions are dangerous. The child simply wants understanding. Somewhere along the journey into adulthood, many people learn that certain questions create discomfort. Certain questions create tension. Certain questions threaten belonging. So instead of exploring them honestly, they learn to suppress them. They learn to distract themselves. They learn to replace curiosity with certainty. But curiosity rarely disappears completely. It waits. It remains hidden beneath the surface. Then one day, life creates circumstances that force it back into the open. If this has ever happened to you, if you have ever found yourself questioning things you once accepted without hesitation, leave a comment and share your experience. Not because there is a right answer waiting somewhere in the comments section, but because many people silently carry these questions believing they are alone. And perhaps one of the most surprising realizations is discovering how many others have stood in the same place. What makes this moment so psychologically powerful is that it is rarely just about belief. On the surface, it appears intellectual, it appears philosophical, it appears to be about ideas, but underneath something much deeper is happening. Human beings do not build their identities solely from facts, they build them from stories. Stories about who they are, stories about why they are here, stories about where they belong, stories about what gives their lives meaning. When a person begins questioning a deeply held belief, they are often not merely questioning an idea. They are questioning part of the story that helped them make sense of existence itself. That is why these moments feel so emotional. That is why they feel frightening. Because uncertainty is not just uncertainty. It can feel like standing on a bridge and suddenly noticing that the structure beneath your feet is not as permanent as you assumed. Imagine someone who spent years believing every event in their life had a clear purpose. Every setback had a reason. Every pain had a lesson. Every delay had meaning. Then one day something happens that feels impossible to explain. Not impossible intellectually, impossible emotionally. A loss so devastating, a betrayal so deep, a tragedy so senseless. Suddenly the framework that once provided comfort begins struggling under the weight of reality, and the person finds themselves caught between two uncomfortable possibilities. Either reality is more complicated than they imagined, or their previous understanding was incomplete. Neither option feels easy. Neither option feels comfortable. Yet this tension may reveal something profound about the human condition. Perhaps meaning was never supposed to eliminate mystery. Perhaps certainty was never supposed to eliminate questions. Perhaps the desire for complete understanding collides with the limits of what it means to be human. Because when you examine history, philosophy, psychology, and personal experience, one pattern appears repeatedly. Human beings desperately want clarity in a universe that often provides ambiguity. We want neat answers to messy realities. We want certainty where uncertainty exists. We want explanations that fully satisfy our emotional needs. Yet reality rarely cooperates. It remains complicated. It remains mysterious. It remains resistant to complete explanation. This does not necessarily mean faith fails. It does not necessarily mean faith succeeds. It may mean that many people unconsciously expect faith to do something it was never designed to do. They expect it to eliminate uncertainty completely. They expect it to answer every question perfectly. They expect it to remove every doubt forever. Then, when doubt inevitably appears, they interpret its presence as failure. But what if doubt is not evidence that something is broken? What if doubt is evidence that a person is engaging honestly with reality? Consider the moments that have shaped you most deeply. Were they moments of certainty, or were they moments of struggle? Moments of questioning? Moments when old assumptions collapsed and something new had to emerge? Growth rarely feels comfortable while it is happening. Growth often feels like confusion. It often feels like disorientation. It often feels like losing something before understanding what might replace it. And perhaps that is why the moment faith stops making sense feels so unsettling. Because it is not merely the loss of an answer. It is the loss of familiarity. It is the loss of psychological safety. It is the realization that some questions may not have simple resolutions. Yet something even more uncomfortable may be hiding beneath all of this. What if the real fear is not that faith stops making sense? What if the real fear is discovering how much of our certainty was connected to our need for control? What if certainty itself sometimes functions as protection against the terrifying reality that existence contains unanswered questions? This possibility unsettles people on every side of the conversation, because nobody enjoys confronting the limits of their own understanding. Nobody enjoys admitting that some mysteries remain mysteries. Nobody enjoys standing in uncertainty. Yet perhaps the individuals who grow the most are not the ones who eliminate uncertainty. Perhaps they are the ones who learn how to live with it. Because there comes a moment when every thoughtful person encounters a crossroads. Not a crossroads between belief and disbelief, not a crossroads between faith and doubt, a crossroads between honesty and avoidance. One path offers temporary comfort through easy answers. The other offers uncertainty, but also authenticity. And that choice often determines the direction of the entire journey. The strange thing is that many people discover something unexpected when they stop running from their questions. The questions themselves begin changing. The goal is no longer winning an argument. The goal is understanding reality more deeply. The goal is no longer defending an identity. The goal is discovering what remains true when certainty becomes difficult. And that shift changes everything. Because once a person reaches that point, they begin seeing questions differently. They begin recognizing that some of the most important questions in life are not problems to solve, but tensions to explore. They begin realizing that the search itself may matter as much as the conclusion. And perhaps that realization is where the real journey begins. But before we go further, there is another uncomfortable possibility we need to examine, one that touches something far deeper than belief itself. Because what if the moment faith stops making sense is not actually about faith at all? What if it reveals something hidden about the human need for meaning, belonging, certainty, and hope that most people spend their entire lives trying not to see? If you have ever wrestled with that possibility, or if you strongly disagree with it, share your perspective below. The answers people give to this question may reveal far more than they realize. There is a reason people remember the exact moment certain beliefs began to unravel, not because the event itself was always dramatic, but because it felt personal. It felt as if reality had quietly walked into the room and rearranged the furniture of the mind while nobody was looking. You wake up one morning and everything appears the same house, the same job, the same family, the same routines, yet something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface. A question that once seemed insignificant now refuses to leave. An explanation that once sounded convincing suddenly feels incomplete. An answer that once provided comfort now creates discomfort. And perhaps the strangest part is that nobody around you notices. You continue showing up. You continue smiling. You continue participating in the same conversations. But internally, an invisible process has begun. You are no longer trying to defend a conclusion. You are trying to understand why you needed that conclusion in the first place. This is where the experience becomes deeply psychological. Most people assume that beliefs are primarily intellectual. They imagine that people adopt ideas because they carefully evaluate evidence and arrive at logical conclusions. Yet human beings are rarely that simple. We are emotional creatures long before we are rational ones. We crave safety. We crave belonging. We crave meaning. We crave certainty in the face of chaos. And because of that, many of our deepest convictions are connected to needs we barely recognize. Imagine someone standing at a funeral. A person they loved is gone forever. The room is filled with grief. Faces are swollen from crying. Conversations feel heavy. The future suddenly appears fragile. In moments like that, people are not merely looking for information. They are looking for something capable of carrying the weight of unbearable emotions. They are looking for a framework that transforms suffering into something survivable. This is not weakness. It is profoundly human. The human mind naturally seeks meaning because meaning makes pain easier to endure. Meaning transforms random suffering into purposeful suffering. Meaning allows people to continue moving forward when circumstances suggest they should collapse. The problem emerges when people begin confusing psychological comfort with certainty. Because the fact that an idea provides comfort does not automatically make it false. But it also does not automatically make it true. And that realization creates an uncomfortable tension that many people spend years avoiding. We all have a tendency to protect ideas that help us survive emotionally. We defend them. We reinforce them. We surround ourselves with people who share them. We avoid information that threatens them, not because we are dishonest, but because human beings instinctively protect the structures that provide stability. Yet eventually life introduces experiences that challenge those structures. Sometimes it happens through tragedy, sometimes through education, sometimes through relationships, sometimes through exposure to people whose lives do not fit neatly into our assumptions. Consider the person who grows up believing that sincere effort always produces reward. Then they watch someone work tirelessly for years only to experience failure after failure. Consider the person who believes good people are protected from unnecessary suffering, then witnesses unimaginable pain affecting individuals who seem undeserving of it. Consider the person who believes certainty is evidence of truth, then encounters equally intelligent, equally sincere individuals who hold completely different certainties. Suddenly, reality becomes more complicated than the story they inherited. The conflict that follows is rarely visible from the outside. It happens quietly. A person begins reading more, thinking more, reflecting more. They revisit assumptions they have not questioned in years. They start noticing inconsistencies they previously ignored. They discover that some answers create as many questions as they resolve, and perhaps most unsettling of all, they begin realizing that uncertainty is not a temporary inconvenience. It may be an unavoidable feature of existence itself. This realization often produces fear because uncertainty feels vulnerable. Certainty creates the illusion of control. It creates the feeling that the future is understandable, manageable, predictable. Uncertainty removes that comfort. It forces a person to acknowledge how little they truly know. And yet, there is another side to this experience that many people overlook. The collapse of certainty can also create freedom. Think about how much energy people spend protecting beliefs they are afraid to question. Think about how exhausting it is to silence doubts before they fully form. Think about how difficult it becomes to maintain absolute confidence when reality continually presents exceptions, contradictions, and mysteries. There is a peculiar relief that sometimes emerges when a person finally admits they do not have every answer. Not because uncertainty feels pleasant, but because honesty feels lighter than pretending. For some people, this is the moment faith stops making sense. For others, it is the moment faith begins making sense in a completely different way. The distinction matters, because what often disappears is not necessarily faith itself. What disappears is a particular version of faith built upon expectations that reality could never satisfy. Many people unconsciously expect faith to function like a shield against confusion, a guarantee against suffering, a protection from doubt, a source of permanent certainty. Then life arrives and demonstrates that none of those expectations are universally reliable. Confusion still appears, suffering still happens, doubt still emerges, questions still remain. And when that happens, a person faces a choice. They can interpret the experience as evidence that everything has collapsed, or they can begin asking whether their original expectations were realistic in the first place. This is where the conversation becomes deeply personal, because every viewer watching this video is bringing their own experiences into it. Some remember unanswered prayers. Some remember seasons of loneliness. Some remember losing someone they loved. Some remember feeling abandoned by the very beliefs that once gave them strength. Others remember discovering a deeper understanding precisely because they went through those struggles. That is why these conversations generate such strong reactions. They are never merely about abstract ideas. They touch wounds. They touch memories. They touch fears. They touch hopes. They touch the stories people tell themselves about who they are and why they are here. If you have ever found yourself standing between certainty and uncertainty, between belief and questioning, between comfort and honesty, leave a comment and describe what that experience felt like. Not the conclusion you reached, the experience itself, because many people understand the destination. Far fewer talk about the journey. One of the most fascinating aspects of this journey is how often people discover that the questions they fear most are not actually intellectual questions. They are emotional ones. A person may think they are asking whether a belief is true, but underneath that question is another one. If this belief changes, who will I become? If this belief changes, where will I belong? If this belief changes, what happens to my identity? What happens to my relationships? What happens to my sense of purpose? These questions carry enormous emotional weight because human beings are social creatures. We do not merely believe ideas. We belong to communities, families, traditions, cultures, histories, shared stories. Challenging a belief can sometimes feel like challenging an entire world. That is why people often resist questions, even when those questions seem reasonable. The resistance is not always intellectual. It is relational, emotional, existential. It is connected to the fear of isolation, and perhaps that fear explains why so many people choose certainty even when uncertainty feels more honest. Humans can tolerate confusion surprisingly well. What they struggle to tolerate is loneliness. We are wired for connection. We want acceptance. We want understanding. We want to feel that we belong somewhere. Sometimes certainty provides belonging. Sometimes questioning threatens it. That reality creates an invisible pressure affecting millions of people every day. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that meaningful growth often begins when individuals become willing to examine assumptions despite the discomfort involved. Not because questioning guarantees better answers. It does not. But because avoiding questions guarantees stagnation. The irony is that many of the most thoughtful people throughout history were not individuals free from doubt. They were individuals willing to engage with doubt honestly. They understood something that modern culture often forgets. Uncertainty is not the opposite of thinking. It is frequently the beginning of it. The desire for absolute certainty can sometimes prevent deeper understanding because it encourages people to stop exploring once they reach a conclusion that feels emotionally satisfying. Yet reality rarely respects emotional preferences. Reality remains complicated whether we like it or not. It remains mysterious whether we acknowledge it or not. It remains larger than our explanations. And this may be where the real tension of this entire discussion begins to emerge, because perhaps the moment faith stops making sense is not actually a moment of failure. Perhaps it is a moment of confrontation, a confrontation between the human desire for certainty and the reality of living in a world filled with ambiguity. A confrontation between inherited answers and personal experience. A confrontation between the stories we tell ourselves and the complexities we cannot ignore. And what happens next may be far more important than the questions themselves, because some people encounter this confrontation and become cynical. Others become curious. Some become defensive. Others become reflective. Some shut down. Others begin searching more deeply than ever before. The difference often depends on one crucial realization that most people do not discover until much later. A realization that changes how they understand belief, doubt, meaning, suffering, and even themselves. And that realization begins with a disturbing question that many people spend years avoiding. What if the deepest thing you believe is not the thing you openly defend, but the thing your life quietly reveals every day through your fears, your hopes, your choices, and the stories you cannot stop telling yourself? That question forces the conversation into territory far more personal than philosophy, because now we are no longer discussing abstract beliefs. We are discussing identity. We are discussing desire. We are discussing the hidden motivations that shape human behavior beneath conscious awareness. And once that door opens, it becomes impossible to look at faith, doubt, certainty, or meaning in exactly the same way again. The disturbing possibility is that most people do not actually discover what they believe by examining the words they say. They discover it by examining the lives they live. A person can repeat a conviction for decades and still be driven by something entirely different beneath the surface. They can speak confidently about certainty while secretly operating from fear. They can speak about freedom while being controlled by anxiety. They can speak about meaning while feeling lost. They can speak about trust while desperately trying to control every possible outcome. And this is where the conversation takes a turn that many people never expect, because the moment faith stops making sense may have less to do with faith than with the hidden assumptions underneath it. Imagine someone spending years believing they are pursuing truth. Then one day they realize they were actually pursuing certainty. The difference sounds small until you experience it personally. Truth and certainty are not always the same thing. Truth can be complicated. Truth can be uncomfortable. Truth can challenge expectations. Certainty, on the other hand, often feels emotionally satisfying. It provides closure. It eliminates ambiguity. It creates the comforting feeling that the difficult questions have already been solved. But life has a habit of exposing the difference. It introduces circumstances that refuse to fit inside neat explanations. It places people in situations where simple answers no longer work. It confronts them with realities that challenge everything they thought they understood. And suddenly the search changes. The goal is no longer preserving certainty. The goal becomes surviving honesty. This is why so many people describe periods of intense questioning as some of the most painful experiences of their lives. Not because they enjoy confusion, not because they enjoy doubt, but because questioning forces them to confront things they previously avoided. It forces them to examine fears they never named. It forces them to investigate motivations they never recognized. It forces them to ask whether they truly wanted understanding or whether they simply wanted reassurance. That question alone has the power to transform an entire life. Because once a person becomes aware of it, they begin noticing patterns everywhere. They notice how often people defend conclusions that protect them emotionally. They notice how frequently certainty increases when evidence decreases. They notice how communities form around shared answers, but rarely around shared uncertainty. They notice how uncomfortable most people become when confronted with ambiguity, and perhaps most importantly, they notice the same tendencies inside themselves. That last part is crucial. It is easy to analyze others. It is much harder to analyze yourself. It is easy to recognize confirmation bias in someone else's thinking. It is much harder to recognize it in your own. It is easy to identify emotional reasoning when another person does it. It is far more difficult when your own fears, hopes, desires, and experiences are influencing the process. Yet this self-awareness may be one of the most valuable outcomes of questioning, because eventually the focus shifts away from winning arguments and toward understanding the human condition itself. You begin realizing that every person is navigating uncertainty. Every person is trying to make sense of existence. Every person is constructing stories that help them live, love, endure suffering, and face mortality. Some stories emphasize certainty. Some emphasize mystery. Some emphasize faith. Some emphasize skepticism. But beneath all of them lies the same fundamental reality. Human beings are attempting to answer questions that may be larger than any single answer can fully contain. Think about the moments when life felt most real, not most comfortable, most real. The birth of a child, the death of a loved one, a devastating heartbreak, an unexpected act of kindness, a moment of overwhelming beauty, a season of profound loneliness. Experiences like these often resist explanation. They touch something deeper than logic alone. They reveal dimensions of existence that cannot be reduced to formulas, and yet they also refuse to provide complete clarity. They leave us with wonder, questions, tension, mystery. Perhaps that is why people throughout history have repeatedly returned to the same themes regardless of culture, background, or worldview: meaning, purpose, suffering, love, mortality, hope. These questions persist because they are woven into the human experience itself. No generation escapes them. No philosophy eliminates them completely. No ideology resolves every aspect of them. They remain. And maybe that permanence tells us something important. Maybe the goal was never to eliminate every question. Maybe the goal was learning how to live thoughtfully in their presence. That possibility can feel disappointing at first. Many people want a final answer, a definitive conclusion, a complete resolution that removes all uncertainty forever. Yet reality rarely offers such gifts. Instead, it offers something more difficult and perhaps more valuable. It offers the opportunity to become the kind of person who can face uncertainty without being destroyed by it. The kind of person who can ask difficult questions without panic. The kind of person who can encounter complexity without immediately demanding simplistic answers. The kind of person who can admit the limits of their understanding while continuing to search sincerely. There is a maturity that emerges from this process. Not the maturity of having every answer, but the maturity of recognizing that some questions deserve patience rather than immediate resolution. The maturity of understanding that confidence and certainty are not identical. The maturity of realizing that intellectual humility is not weakness. The maturity of accepting that being human means existing between knowledge and mystery. And perhaps this is where the title of this video reveals its deeper meaning. The moment faith stops making sense is often portrayed as an ending, a collapse, a failure, a loss. But what if that interpretation is incomplete? What if, for many people, it is actually a beginning? Not the beginning of certainty, not the beginning of unbelief, not the beginning of some predetermined conclusion, the beginning of honesty, the beginning of self-examination, the beginning of a deeper encounter with reality. Because when faith makes perfect sense, when every question appears answered, when every contradiction appears resolved, when every uncertainty disappears, there is a danger that curiosity dies. There is a danger that growth stops. There is a danger that certainty becomes more important than truth. Yet, when a person reaches the point where faith no longer fits neatly into simple categories, something else becomes possible. They begin engaging with life more directly. They stop relying exclusively on inherited answers. They start examining their own experiences, their own assumptions, their own motivations, their own fears. They begin asking not merely what they believe, but why they believe it. Not merely what they hope is true, but why they hope it is true. Not merely what they fear, but why they fear it. These questions are uncomfortable because they expose vulnerability. They remove the illusion that we are completely objective observers. They reveal how deeply emotion, identity, culture, relationships, and personal history shape our thinking, yet they also create the possibility of genuine self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is rarely comfortable. It forces people to confront contradictions. It forces them to recognize blind spots. It forces them to acknowledge uncertainty. But it also allows them to become more honest, more compassionate, and more aware of the complexity present in both themselves and others. If you have made it this far, consider this question carefully. Not what conclusion you have reached, not what label best describes your beliefs, not which side of an argument you identify with. Ask yourself something deeper. What happened inside you the first time certainty began to crack? What emotions appeared? What fears emerged? What possibilities opened? Because the answer to that question may reveal far more about your relationship with faith, doubt, meaning, and identity than any debate ever could. And perhaps that is the realization many people spend years moving toward. The opposite of certainty is not necessarily doubt. The opposite of certainty may be openness. Openness to questions, openness to complexity, openness to growth, openness to the possibility that reality is larger than any single explanation. Whether that realization strengthens faith, transforms faith, challenges faith, or leads somewhere entirely unexpected will differ from person to person. But the journey itself reveals something universal. Every human being eventually reaches a moment when the old answers feel insufficient. Every human being eventually encounters questions that cannot be ignored. Every human being eventually stands at the edge of uncertainty and decides what to do next. And in that moment, the most important question may not be whether faith still makes sense. The most important question may be whether you are willing to face reality honestly wherever the search leads, even if the answer turns out to be far more complicated than you ever imagined.